Thanks so much. This is a very heavy topic to have in the graveyard shift. So let's try and make it a little bit interactive. I think that maybe many of you have published already and can contribute to this conversation. So there are two parts to this presentation. The one is kind of some of the technical stuff, and then there's the detail of all the different sections in any article. And I just want to acknowledge two people before I continue whose work this presentation is based on. The one is Professor Tad Metz, who is an A-rated researcher, who used to be at UJ but is now at another university in South Africa, and Chris Kep, who I attended his Writing for Publication workshop, which was the first publication workshop I attended, and I think it changed my life. So I'm very grateful to that group of researchers and people. Here we go. Okay. There we go. Okay. There's quite a few different things that I want to cover, but as you know, that the time has gone today, and we are kind of an hour late, and we tried to squeeze this into the time for refreshments. So we will try and get through as much as we can, and if not, we can go through to tomorrow. But it's hard to negotiate around the online presentations because we have people across the world, and so we don't want to mess up some of the technical sessions that are linked to people who may be in other parts of the world. Okay, so some preliminary information about publishing, and this is what we're going to talk about in the first bit today, which is when, what, where of publishing, and then we'll talk a little bit about self-plagiarization, formatting, and then the second part is really about the content of the publication, which is about the abstract, the introduction, the body and conclusions. And the last thing is about the letter to the editor. So that's quite a lot of things that we want to try and cover, but we want this to be as useful to you as possible. Okay. So when do we publish? I'm going to grab the mic because I hate standing. I don't like standing behind a counter. Okay, so it helps if we have original material. If you've got empirical data, it always it's a good idea to publish it. I was actually saying earlier to Alexis around her work on suicide, as she published it yet, and she said, you know, we get so caught up in our everyday lives that she hasn't yet. And I was like, it's really important that we do publish what we have, and she's got some amazing original material that needs to be published. And especially if it's new relative to the existing material, because it's not just useful for other researchers, but particularly the kind of work that Alexis was talking about can push research in the field, but also practice. So what she was offering was a practice model as well, which would be very useful because she was talking about the exits and how do we prevent suicidality, right? So that would make a really good article. And then before you start any article, I mean, in fact, for our fourth year students and master students, even PhD students, so you need to, and those of you who have supervisors, use them. They are a fantastic resource. And then if you don't have a supervisor, like those of you who may already feel and finish with your PhDs, maybe mentors are great to work with in terms of helping you to publish, especially if you get somebody who's very good at publishing or has been publishing a lot. I don't want to say I'm an expert, as I always say to our students. Writing and publishing requires writing, rewriting, and editing. So there's no such thing as I go home and write a publication. What you see is published is months and weeks and years of work. And I always say to my students, you don't think you can go home and write this chapter and submit it to me tomorrow and expect that it's going to be okay, because it's not. Because that's what students do, right? All of those of you who are lecturers. So there's a lot of reading and writing and sort of this constant cycle of developing our work, in that it's never ever comes to perfection. I'm sure those of us who kind of publish something and you pick up oh my God, I have that error, or this I could have changed, and this is what I could do differently. And the question usually people ask is, do you have to be invited to a journal? In fact, we find that a lot of predatory journals are nowadays inviting people to submit. So be very careful of where you publish and make sure it's not a predatory journal. And you usually can submit to a journal, you don't need an invitation. What you need to do though is to understand how to choose a journal, but we'll come to that just now. But I think this issue of the writing cycle is important. It's what I've just mentioned just now, is that, the easy part of the writing, sorry, I'm pressing multiple buttons. There we go. The easy part is the planning, I think. So we can plan, and we can plan what we want to put in our journal, and this is the beginning process. Either you're going to do it alone, or you're going to do it with other authors, or you plan with your supervisor or your mentor what you want to write about. But this is the hardest part, the actual writing, getting that first draft out. That is the critical, most difficult thing. Once we get the first draft out, I think that the rest of the stages are easier, although we can get stuck, because sometimes we spend time on this and it goes for review, and when we come back, we caught up with something else, and then we don't manage to get to the next stage of redrafting. I have a couple of manuscripts on my desk which need to be redrafted, because feedback from reviewers can sometimes be rather harsh and difficult to deal with, or sometimes we may disagree with our reviewers, but don't give up, right? Work through it. And sometimes even if you get rejected, you can go to another journal, because it may be that that's the wrong journal for your article. And then of course it goes to the editor, and then you come back to the same process, okay? So, but it's an ongoing process, and if your journal gets rejected, don't give up. Come back and redraft. Take on board the comments that you've received. It's a learning opportunity. As I said, none of us are perfect in our first, second, or third submissions sometimes, but we can always learn and grow and get the feedback and use it to submit elsewhere. Okay. So I think this is a kind of what to publish may be different depending on your context. So in the South African context, we tend to be told to publish in a particular field because we have something called the National Research Foundation, and you get a rating depending on how much your work is within a particular umbrella heading. But I think in general, it's useful to not be too diverse in your publications so that you can get known in a particular field. So the more you publish in a particular field, the more known you become in that field, rather than doing too many different fields, or too many. Even within education's a very big field, and there are like multiple topics within education, within social work, whatever your discipline may be, but within that there's so many different streams. So try and choose one stream that works for you and that you are passionate about, and try to master that niche so that you can become known in your field. Of course, you don't have to limit yourself, but it helps in terms of becoming a specialist if you want to become a specialist. Then the next issue is, who is your audience? I think they even say when you speak, you need to know who your audience is going to be. So if you're talking to academics, your conversation will be very different to if you're talking to activists or if you are talking to people who are practitioners, right? So you got to make sure that your audience, or you know who you are writing for. And that's where selecting your journal becomes very important, because then you can target your way of writing or what you're writing about based on the journal that you're going to be sending your article to. And you also keep the house style of the journal in mind as you write, because you need to conform to that submission. So you'll find that some journals, I think it was again Alexis who this morning mentioned that there wasn't much research produced that's qualitative in suicidality in a particular journal. So if you're doing qualitative work on suicidality, you're not going to send it to that particular journal because they mostly publish quantitative work. So you need to understand what is acceptable for the journal. Okay. And a piece of advice is that you try to see if you can reference one or two articles from the journal you're targeting, because that also shows that you've read the work in that journal and you understand what that journal is looking for. So I guess these are just kind of the tricks of the trade, or understanding how editors and publishers work. And then how to choose a journal. This can be quite overwhelming. This can be quite overwhelming because there are lots of journals out there, something in a particular article. Okay, and this is where you can ask your colleagues, your mentors, people who have published a lot in your field, what do they suggest? Read articles from the journal that you're targeting to get an idea of what kind of articles they publish in your field. So it may be called Violence Against Women, but it may have a specific angle. It may be very qualitative, or it may be actually very much directed to policymakers. And you know what kind of article you want to write, or also what kind of article you can write, because there may also be limitations in your data which will determine how you angle your article, right? Because every article needs to have some kind of argument. So can you make an argument, or can it fit into the kind of style and approach and audience of your journal? And those are the questions you need to ask yourself. And if not, find a different journal, okay? Because obviously you want to increase your chances of your journal article being accepted the first time you send it for review. You don't want to have to get feedback and get rejected and sent to a different journal. Then you also want to see what is the ranking of your journal in your field. Is it a really highly ranked journal? That doesn't mean we only publish in highly ranked journals. It also depends on where you are at in your career. If you just an entry level researcher publishing firm, you can go over the highest ranking and that's because publish in. It obviously means people who are experts in your field are publishing there. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you need to kind of evaluate your study, where it's at, and to what extent you think the likelihood is. And try and have Scopus journals, especially if, like our university, Scopus means everything these days. So when I started publishing, we didn't really talk much about Scopus. We didn't really talk much about rankings, but this seems to be the new neoliberal agenda. So if you want to play that game, then I guess you got to think about these kinds of questions. And again, and the journal. Okay. And then if all else fails and you're still unsure, develop an abstract of 150 words and then send it to the editor and see what the editor says. Is this something that the journal would be interested in? One of the things that I think has helped a lot in publishing for me was looking for special issue journals. Special edition journals in your field are really a fantastic place to publish, because firstly, you know that it has a higher likelihood of being accepted because it's right up your alley, and also you've then being published with other experts in your field. So if someone's looking for a journal on, or looking for some information on, let's just say, decoloniality or indigenization issue on, that's the first place people are going to go to look for the article, right? Because you're obviously writing because you want people to read it, not just to publish for the sake of it, right? Am I right? You want as much readership as possible. Okay. We're still talking about where to publish. Again, do you have what is the kind of theoretical impact that you want to have, and is this relevant to your field? Maybe in social work it's a practical impact, in philosophy you want a theoretical impact, so it depends on which field you are in. I spoke about impact already, or rank or reputational. Again, what is the practical impact? How do you want your article to be used? What we said earlier, what is the chance of acceptance or rejection? Write to the editor. Okay. And then also, what is your time? Are you in a hurry to have your publication get out, because you know the publication process can take between 3 to 7 years or more. So what is the time between your submission and the decision that you're willing to wait, right? If the journal has a long waiting list for publication and you want something out very quickly, then that's not going to help you. And that's where sometimes book chapters are quicker, but they don't have the same impact as journals. They're not as easily accessible. So those are the kinds of various decisions you have to think about when you are looking for a place to publish. And then will you be able to, if you want comments, will you be able to get that from the journal you're looking at? And also in some contexts, double-blind peer review is not that important. So some people who edit books don't get their books double-blind peer reviewed. They just get the proposal of the book double-blind peer reviewed. In the South African context, that does not work. Every single article has to be double-blind peer reviewed. But in some contexts, that's not an issue, and then you can publish much quicker. So the review process does delay publication a lot. But it's a criteria in the South African context, so we cannot do anything without double-blind peer review. And then again, your scope of readership. So who do you want to impact? What is the aim of the article? Who do you think it will be most valuable to? Another very important issue is cost. Look at page fees, and open access fees are ridiculous in some international journals, European journals, American journals. They ask for a lot of money to publish in their journals. So can you afford it? Will your university pay for those fees? Do you have some funds to pay for those fees? If not, then obviously that journal is not for you. Right? There's no point doing all of this for your journal, then you can't afford it. Okay. And then, of course, as I said, what does your university want? Do they want you to publish in ISI journals, IBSS journals, Scopus journals? What are the requirements of your environment? Or if you're not in an academic institution, you want to communicate with NGOs or policymakers, then your criteria and your selection of a journal could be quite different. Okay. As I said earlier, editions in your field, that's just really amazing and quick way of publishing, but also great readership, because people are going to look for those special editions when they want to read about that field. Okay. And then I don't know if you've noticed now, a lot of journal articles get printed or published online, but they're in a queue to actually get an ISSN or IBSS number, and that may take much longer. And so if they have a lot of journals that still have to be officially published, not just online publishing, they're still in press, then it may be more difficult to get into that journal because they've got a long queue. Okay. So that if there's a major backlog, then your odds of getting accepted are lower than if a journal has more space. So if there's little backlog, then there's a greater odds of your journal article being accepted. Of course, if it's relevant and fits in with the criteria of the journal. So all of the other things matter. So it's always worth checking what is happening with early access or in print, what's happening with a lot of the other journal articles in that particular journal. Also, if a journal has issues, then less issues, then you have a greater chance of also being published because they need more material. So if you have a journal that only has 3 or 4 editions a year as compared to a journal who has 8 editions a year, you have greater chance of being published if that journal has 8 editions a year. If that makes sense. Yeah? Okay. So, I mean, we've been talking a lot about open access and what the advantages and disadvantages are of open access. We know, obviously, in academia, whose universities don't subscribe to journals. Sometimes, and I think this is changing, online-only journals sometimes have less stature. There may be more newer journals. They may not be cited as often by scholars, but I think this is changing very quickly with the kind of movement to open access and to make sure that knowledge becomes available to move away from a neoliberal agenda. Okay. And then the question of, I've published in this journal before, should I publish in there again? If you have been successful, it's likely that you could be successful again. So that may be a good publish if you want something out quickly, or you know it fits with the kind of work you do. You also may publish in the same journal if it's a good resource or journal in your field or country. So, I mean, I've published a bit in Agenda, which is one of the few feminist journals in South Africa and Africa. Initially, especially when I first started, because it directly fitted with the kind of work I was doing, which kind of is both academic and activist. But the cons is people may start to think that you either have inside connections or that you're unable to publish elsewhere. So you need to have a bit of a variety, and you don't want to only be seen as publishing in the same journal all the time, and also be very, very careful of predatory journals. And can you submit a journal to same article to more than one journal? And it's a resounding no. Okay, you can only submit to one journal at a time. You can submit a different article to a different journal, but not, and in fact that's a good idea. The more you can put out there at any one time, the better. Those of you who are really prolific at writing, that's a really good idea. But it's not a good idea to send to two journals, because what if they both accept it? And then you'll have a bit of a conflict and a difficulty. You cannot publish the same paper in two different places without getting permission. If you've published something a while ago, it's usually easier to get permission for publishing it again. But if it's a recent publication, that's more difficult. Okay. If you're publishing from a thesis, that's usually not considered published, even though it is in the published domain. But if something is has an ISBN or ISS number, then it is counted as published. Okay. You could use elements, or to a very limited extent, in a new publication, as long as you cite the original material, as long as you're not copying and pasting from the one into the next. There may be some overlaps, because if you're using the same data, but in a different article with a different argument, you could have a similar methodology. In fact, a lot of the time your methodology may be the same, because it's the same data collection, the same data that you collected, but you writing something completely different. So you may write one theme in one article and a completely different theme in another article. This is especially the case when you're publishing from your doctorate. You can usually get 4 articles from your doctorate, depending on how much information it generated. And then you may use a similar methodology in different articles. Okay, so do you have to change and conform to the journal's house style? So in terms of referencing, spelling, headings, so sometimes for example, if you are publishing for your PhD and you used Harvard, and you now want to publish in a journal that has APA, sometimes you may want to just write a cover letter to your editor and say, I have not done so at this stage, but if my articles gets accepted, I will change the formatting. Because we don't know if that article will get accepted in this particular journal. As long as you notify the editor that you will conform to the house style if your journal article gets accepted. Because imagine you have to send this to 3 different journals, and they have completely different styles and different referencing systems. Although these days with EndNote and all of these kinds of systems, it's usually quite easy to change it. But there may be other things. It may be the heading style, it may be the length, etc. But the length is usually quite important to try and stick to, because they may not even look at your article. If the journal says 5,000 words and yours is 8,000 words, they may not even look at it. So that's one of the things to be quite considerate about. So some journals are quite sticky. So you may write a letter to some journals, but other journals may say that they're not even going to consider it if you don't conform to the house style. And if that's what they say in the instructions, so it's really quite important to read the instructions. All journals have very clear instructions around what they want you to do and what they're negotiable about. So make sure you have read that and understood that, okay? If your editor has accepted your paper or invited your paper, then again, make sure you conform to the house style. And if you know that the editor would not be happy if you don't, then obviously make an effort to do so. Okay, and then there's the issue of being professional. Make sure that your references are complete. Have both classic references as well as recent references. And keep your formatting consistent. So if you're using APA, it must be APA, not APA, half Harvard, half different systems, okay? And I mean, as I said, these days we are so lucky. We have so many different types of programs. I'm still not very good at them, but they are there to use and they're fantastic, okay? And again, try to make sure that your document is as clean as possible in terms of spelling, grammar, etc. So, what is our time like, Mahisha? Sorry? So, how much time do we still have? Oh, brilliant. Lots of time. Okay, great. Then I don't have to rush so much. So, we'll move from some of the kind of preliminary things to think about to actually looking at the content of the article. Okay. So, try not to make your article title too long, okay? You're assuming you're writing in English, but if it's another language, you can replace English with French or German or Swahili or whatever language the journal accepts work in. So if it's in English, then make sure you don't use foreign words, or if you mention a place that isn't globally well known, or even if you try to make sure you keep your title as clear as possible so that people can understand, and when they read your title, they know what it's about, okay? So obviously, if it's in German, then you'll keep it all in German. And you want it to be short and punchy, okay? It's interesting that the studies show that articles with shorter titles tend to be cited more often. That's interesting. And then you want your title to reflect what you're doing. And so try not to be too short so that it's not reflective of anything. So something like curriculum in education is too broad. Curriculum, right? But at the same time, you want to attract as many readers as possible. And sometimes, if there's some things you can't include in the actual title, this is where keywords come in, right? So that you can have more things in your keywords. Keywords are very important because keywords are often the words that I use to find your article. So in my research on gender-based violence, in my actual research, my thesis, I used the word woman abuse because I argue in the thesis that the focus was really on how women were abused. It wasn't on gender-based violence. It wasn't on men abuse or transgender abuse or anything else. But yet sometimes, or it wasn't really only on domestic violence, because domestic violence, in my view, has different meanings. But in my keywords, I may keep those words in because those are the words that people use to refer to women abuse. Okay. So, I mean, that's also something I learned later on. I didn't really know that in the beginning. Then the abstract. Every journal or article or chapter has an abstract. Even a book has an abstract. This is a very funny analogy. The abstract is like appearing for the first date. Groom it. So make sure your abstract is really beautiful and really represents what you want to say. Okay. The shorter the abstract, the better. So around 150 words. And make the abstract only one paragraph. Avoid citation. In fact, most journals don't want citations in your abstracts. and very few reviewers will read a 300-word abstract. Okay, so basically, your abstract needs to talk to what you discovered. So what is new about your article? What is the argument that you're presenting in your article? What something that's going to attract your reader to want to read the article, but also to guide the reader, because if you're doing, say, a systematic literature review, or you're doing a I forget what's the other one called, systematic, and the other one, I can't think. Or a meta-analysis, or scoping, whatever. People will look at your abstract. They're not going to look at your whole article. If they downloaded 300 or 500 articles and they have to select from those to include in the systematic literature review or scoping review, or there's another type of review that I'm thinking of that I can't remember right now, they're going to only read your abstract. Okay. So it really needs to include something about what you discovered, what was new, what was innovative, what was different. You need to also talk about your methodology, because sometimes if you're doing a scoping review that's only on qualitative research, then that needs to be clear up front, or quantitative, or participatory action research, or whatever kind of methodology you were using. And as I said earlier, what is new and original, and also what is your argument? What argument are you making in your paper? Okay. So the abstract must really be able to stand alone. So when I read the abstract, I mean, it's so crazy. In 350 words, you should be able to summarize a whole dissertation, right? Of 20,000, 30,000, or whatever, how many thousand words that dissertation is. But actually, it's possible. We've seen it. We've all done it. Okay. And its meaning should not depend on the rest of the paper. So when you read it, you should be able to immediately know what that article is about. Okay. And this is also true of the introduction. If I need to read the introduction of your paper, I should have a really good idea of what your paper is about in a bit more detail than your abstract. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to the introduction. I just want to grab some water there. Excuse me for a second. Oh no, I went right to the beginning. We're not starting again, definitely not at this hour. So I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of time on the introduction with my students, because it's really a key moment for anyone reading as to whether they're going to continue reading what you've written. Right? Whether it makes sense, whether it's whether it talks to the work that they're doing. Okay. So you will have a research question. You don't have to frame it as my research question is, but within the context of what you're writing, your research question will become evident. I recently read an article about whether journal articles have the research question in it. And interestingly, from this meta-analysis, they found that most research articles actually don't have the research question clearly embedded in the article. And they had a whole analysis about why this was a problem. So it's interesting, and I think it's an important point that it's good to have your question and either your aim, your objective, or your main research question, or the question for that particular paper. Because you may have had a broader question in your study, but in this particular paper, you're answering one question, which may not be the bigger question. It may be one part of the bigger question. So just to be clear on what this paper is addressing. And then also, how will you answer that question? So what is your thesis statement? What is kind of the core findings around this, and maybe a core conclusion around it? And what is new in this paper compared to the existing literature? Okay. You may also want to include your limitations, some assumptions, and maybe one or two points about your methodology. Prof. Matt says you must include all but not more than this in your introduction. Okay, so these are the key elements. Okay, again, make sure your introduction is short and punchy and not more than 10% of your total article. Okay, it won't include the details of the argument because this is what you have the rest of the paper for, and as you continue with the rest of your paper, you're going to talk about what is the aim to be achieved in each section and how does this contrast to the previous section as you go on. Oh, have I skipped to the body? I was thinking that didn't make sense. Okay. We covered that. So the body of the paper, again, depends on how long you are allowed in your, what are the requirements of the journal? So most journals is between 5,000 to maybe sometimes 10,000, but the average is about 8,000 words. So you have a couple of sections, but you can't write so one article. You can get multiple articles from your dissertation. You probably only talk to maybe one or two themes in your article and sub-themes. Okay. And try to keep your sections equivalent in length and use subheadings to make it easier for the reader to follow. Okay, so you want to have small and manageable chunks and must be clear to the reader to be able to see the different themes that you want to address in the article, and you can use subsections for each of the different themes. Okay, and with each section, as I was saying earlier, I was thinking, what do you want to achieve? And this is really about writing paragraphs anyway. Each paragraph should have a main idea, and what is the main idea or main argument you're making in that particular paragraph, and that applies to the section as well. And how does that aim contrast with the previous section? Okay, now we talk about the conclusion. I often see this with my students where they start to bring in new ideas in the conclusion. The conclusion is not a place for new ideas. All your ideas should have been in the main body. If you have not substantiated any of your claims in your main body, you cannot bring it into your conclusion. You cannot make a conclusion about something you've not discussed in your main body, right? You're going to draw conclusions about what you've already claimed. Okay. So you're basically going to summarize some of your main points and maybe propose an argument. Okay. What are the key things that came up, and what is the key argument you made? What was the evidence for those arguments? And what do you suggest in future, which is your recommendations? Again, conclusions should be short, between 5 to 10% of your document. It should say something interesting. And for us in social work and other social sciences, we usually like to have recommendations. So what do you suggest? What do we do about suicidality? What do we do about violence against women? What do we do about poverty or mental health? Right, so this is particularly important for us in social work and psychology and more applied fields. This may not be the case in maybe philosophy or more theoretical framed areas. But it may have recommendations for other things, for further work or further research or further thinking. Yes? So don't use bullet points. Generally in articles, I don't like bullet points. Try and synthesize your arguments in sentences that make sense. Give an overarching perspective of what you were trying to argue. And maybe, sometimes people use metaphors. Metaphors are really nice. If you have a metaphor that runs through your paper, from the introduction, you may have a metaphor, and maybe there's a conclusion to that metaphor. Maybe you can use a quotation or return to a conclusion. Asay used he used a quotation of one of his participants in his title. So you may want to talk about the value of that quotation in your introduction, and maybe again in your conclusion. That quotation may be in the body of your paper. It may have if you're going to use a quotation, it must have significance for the entire argument that you're making in your paper. Okay. And it must, there must be unity in your entire paper. So there must be a link between your introduction, your body, and your conclusion. It's a story. You're telling a story, right? From beginning to end. So why did you start doing this research? What was interesting about it? What is the rationale for your research? Then you're providing your evidence, and then in your conclusion, you're summarizing, and you're making some kind of argument about the conclusion or the kind of thesis statement that you made. So you started off with the question, and basically now you're trying to answer it through your discussion, and in your conclusion, you want to say, what is the answer? Do you have an answer? You don't have an answer? You're still thinking about an answer? What did you say earlier? You may not have, was it you? Substantive answers. I can't remember. One of the colleagues said, when they said, it was you, what did you say? Remind us? Yeah, answers are not guaranteed. And I think it's the same about research, right? Answers are not guaranteed. Sometimes your research raises many more questions than it actually answers. And that's also what you can address in your conclusion. What are some of the questions that answer? What have you taken for granted? Okay. What are some of the assumptions you made when you started the study and maybe you were proved wrong, or things you didn't think about that emerged in your study? What other questions do you think should be asked, or what research should be done? And again, what recommendation you would like to make? Okay. As I said before, when you think you're done with your paper, get feedback from your colleagues, get feedback from your friends. With my students, I always tell them, ask somebody who's not in academia to read it and see if they understand what you're saying. Because sometimes when you read students' papers, you think, gosh, did they really write this? Do they know what they're saying? Because the legibility and clarity of your argument should be available to anybody. Anybody should be able to read what you're saying. Maybe the language may be a bit more than what everyday people would use in their everyday conversations, but it should be clear enough for somebody to understand it. Yeah, I don't know about you, but when I read those papers, that I think, gosh, what is this person saying? And I have to read it 10 times to get the meaning. Let's make our work accessible so people can read it and understand it, because the point of writing is for people to read. And the more people that can read it, the better, not just academics. Okay? This is also really useful, is that sometimes you get to that point where you can't see the wood from the trees, like me right now. At the end of the day, long day, you've been working with this stuff the whole day, the whole week, the whole month, and you have no idea what you're writing and what you're reading anymore. Just set it aside for a few days and print it. When you read it in print as compared to on the computer, it's completely different. You pick up your mistakes, you pick up your spelling errors, you pick up your grammar errors. There's a lot you pick up, and then you can correct that. Okay? Don't submit something for publication that you've not had anybody look at other than yourself, because we can't see our own blind spots. Every one of us has blind spots, and we have particular beliefs or values or views in our paper which may sometimes not be substantiated, or we have certain ideas in our head that maybe are not adequately substantiated in our paper. And that's where people can come back and give you feedback and say, I guess like we just gave the last presenter feedback, she was making certain assertions, but she hadn't really proved it from her evidence. So her evidence for her arguments were not strong. So it may be a good argument. I don't know anything much about the book, but I shouldn't have to know anything about the book to be able to see if the arguments are valid. So that's what's called trustworthiness in research, right? You provide the evidence for what you're saying. What is the basis for making those assumptions? And on what basis, either theoretically or based on the literature or based on your actual evidence, empirical data, this is why you're making this particular assertions. And so you need other people to see your blind spots, okay? As you are doing now, present the paper at a conference, because this is a great place to also get input, like our previous speakers got input on their papers, so that they have that kind of feedback before they submit it to a journal. Yeah, I'm not even sure if these are enough. I don't know if I've got like version 22, version 35 of my articles before it even gets submitted, and then you still have a couple of drafts after you get feedback from your reviewers. Okay. Yeah, so basically just don't submit yourself don't set yourself up for failure, and don't waste other people's time by jumping to submit something when you haven't done many of these things, when you haven't checked if it's the right journal, if there's a fit between your work and the journal, if you've not had someone to do some proofreading. If you can get an editor to language edit it, that's even better. It increases the success of you getting it accepted. Ask your friends, colleagues to read it, or people who work in the field with you. We've done quite a few writing research groups where we get colleagues in a team to read our papers, and we have discussions on those papers, and we get feedback from people who may not be working in the field. Because there's also often assumptions we make when we work in a particular field. We have kind of this group think, yeah? We start thinking in the same way, and then someone from another field reads it and says, well, or another discipline, right? Reads it and says, oh, well, have you thought about this? So this doesn't make any sense. This just seems too presumptuous. So it's getting that kind of feedback is really important. Then the last thing is always write a letter to the editor in your cover, just to say what you're submitting, whatever the name of your paper is, saying that it's not been previously published and that you're not submitting it elsewhere, because that's quite important. So we have to also get our articles suitable for blind review, right? And what you do when you're doing blind reviews, you don't put your articles, you don't reference your articles with your name on the paper. So you would put author 1 or author 2 if there's more than one author, if you are one of the people that you cite. And that makes it ready for blind review, and your name will not be anywhere on that paper or your fellow authors. So it needs to be suitable for blind review. If, for example, you're not going to, then you need to let the editor know why not. I'm not sure what reason that could be. And then if you say that you haven't exceeded the word limit, but if you have exceeded it, let's just say they asked for 7,000 and you got 7,500 or 8,000, you could say that if the paper gets accepted, you will trim it down based on the reviews. You will reduce the paper. Okay. And again, similarly with if you've not conformed to house style, if it's APA and you've used Harvard or something else, then you can just say, I haven't conformed, but I will do so. Should it be accepted or should it be considered? Okay. Then, of course, you provide your contact details, your date, and maybe if you want to, a reason as to why you think this paper fits with the journal. Okay. And then, when you've submitted your journal, forget about it and start looking at your next journal. Don't stress about when it's going to come and when it's not going to come and how far it is. I mean, you would have already done your research about the journal and what your waiting time should be. Obviously, if it's there for like a year and you still haven't heard something, you're obviously going to follow up. But it's good to just continue writing and hoping that you get published, okay? And that you will get feedback from the journal. If you don't, because sometimes there's hold up, like I know we did a special edition for gender issues based on the work of people from these conferences, from the first 4 conferences. And right now, gender issues does not have an editor, so people are not getting feedback. So these are the kinds of things after about 4 or 5 months, you'll follow up and say, I've sent my paper, I haven't heard back from you, can you let me know? Is it in process? If they haven't yet communicated with you. Or you may find out something like that is happening, the journal doesn't have an editor or whatever the case might be. So, but don't give up. Just continue to write and take on board the feedback that you get. Don't be despondent by the feedback. Don't be disheartened by the feedback. This journal may not like your work, but another journal may like your work. Or if the journal says to you, the language is not quite right, then you go and get an editor. If the journal says to you, well, these arguments are not sufficiently made, go and make the arguments. Use it as a learning opportunity to improve your work and to engage with other researchers in the field, even though you don't know who they are. And to learn about, or maybe there's updated literature that or from a different context, like earlier someone was suggesting literature from the Philippines that Masai could use. So that your reviewers may do such kind of connections around areas where you may not have a lot of access to the work. You may use we know that the coloniality of knowledge still exists, that most of the literature that we use is from the first world. So how do we access? Sometimes we don't have as much access to other global south literature, and that may be another opportunity to get access to new thinkers and other thinkers in the field who are doing different kinds of cutting edge research in your field, and your reviewers can send you that information. Yeah, and I really, even though English is my first language, I still use a language editor, because you also find that American English is different from British English, and British English is different from Sri Lankan English, and Sri Lankan English is different from, so just use an editor. It really helps things a lot. It does cost money, but it really also does help with making sure that your paper is clean for publication.